Well, this evening I want to start a brand new series on serving. Are you riveted? Serving. Y- y- when I get into this series, just a little map of where we're going. I want to be somewhat general this evening. I'm not going to get very specific on what service looks like. I'm going to be more specific about heart attitude in service. But in the coming weeks, I want to talk to you about serving through encouragement, serving through friendship, serving through your ministry here at church, and look at different aspects of serving, and we're going to get really hands-on and tangible in the coming days. So looking forward to that. So I've entitled this evening just Faithful to Serve. That is a phrase that is probably the most underrated phrase in our society. Like that gets no media. Fox News does not have any headlines saying faithful to serve. None of the mainstream media outlets would even come close to something like that because people don't get attention by serving and being faithful to serving. I'm reminded of that when I come into the corridor of our church, the entryway there to the south, and you look immediately to your left and you see the Goodyard room. Goodyard. Who was Goodyard? Well, that's Henry Goodyard, who came from a pretty rough past, could curse like a sailor like you wouldn't believe, had lived a life as a womanizer, and just way off in left field, and yet God got a hold of him, and he was willing to do anything. And the day before God took him home with a heart attack, he called me up on my cell phone and said, "Hey, Pastor, we just want you to know I got those light bulbs swapped out for you." The day before he went home to be with the Lord, he was faithful to the end with no limelight whatsoever. And then you come in a little bit more and you look to the right, you see the Dave Hufford room. So who's Dave Hufford? Well, Dave Hufford was a man who had beat cancer twice, and he was going through so much pain he had a morphine pump in his abdomen to pump morphine into his body. His wife, Helen, would try to slow him down, and Miss Helen's probably listening on YouTube this evening, from her home. But as Dave would see an opportunity, he would jump at it. He's the one who found that new property at 285 South 42nd Street and sold me on the need to build a building there. And he was the one who was fine being backstage, giving me all the shots, and I was the guy looking good with the megaphone giving orders, but he was the brain behind me that was really driving this whole project to renovate a dilapidated old piece of property into something that shined. It was a great first impression. And he stayed faithful to the end until God took him home in 2012. He's just faithful to serve in spite of the pain. And then if you were to go across our fellowship hall and you look over in the Whitworth room, it's a smaller room, kind of backstage, not really obvious because I think it represented Miss Denise Whitworth well. See, Denise Whitworth was our bookkeeper when I first came, and she was just faithful. She didn't like the limelight. She didn't like being on the platform. She was fine just keeping the books and signing the checks. And then she was all amped up about retiring and all the time she could put into ministry, and no sooner had she retired that her health deteriorated. And because of her diabetes, she became legally blind. She'd have to take a magnifying glass up to 50-point font just to read and to see really what was going on. What would she do? She became one of our mightiest prayer warriors, and she stayed faithful in spite of her lost health, the pain, the difficulty that she went through, and she was faithful to the end. The Friday morning that the Lord took her home a year ago this week, the Wednesday night before, she was sitting right around where Brother Jesse and Miss Katrina are tonight, just sitting there faithful all the way to the end. You see, we named the rooms after these people because they were faithful to serve. There are no neon lights out there. The least we can do is have their names attached to a room. These were backstage people. None of them were preachers of the gospel. They weren't overseas missionaries. They were just faithful to serve. But Jesus made a statement about a man that didn't get much media and press back in his day. He said, there is none other greater than John the Baptist. Let me put it in modern terms. Jesus, according to his words, is saying, there has been no greater person up to my time that has walked on planet Earth than John, my cousin. And he said it at a time where he'd already lost his life, had been beheaded because he couldn't keep his bony finger out of the king's face. And he was faithful to the end. And so we see this serving spirit that kept John faithful in John chapter 3. I invite you to turn over there, John chapter 3. And I want to read a few verses about John's ministry and really what drove him. We're not going to look at a whole biographical sketch. We're just going to look at really his mindset and his motives here. But in John chapter 3, verse 22, it says, after these things came Jesus and his disciples into the land of Judea, and there he tarried with them and baptized them. And John also was baptizing in Aenon near to Salem, because there was much water there, and they came and were baptized, for John was not yet cast into prison. Then there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying. And they came unto John and said unto him, Rabbi, he that was with thee beyond Jordan, to whom thou bearest witness, behold, the same baptizeth, and all men come to him. John answered and said, a man can receive nothing except to be given him from heaven. Ye yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. He that hath the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy, therefore, is fulfilled. Now read verse 30 with me, because I think this brings all of it to a head. It summarizes everything about John. Read it with me. You ready? He must increase, but I must decrease. Let's talk this evening about being faithful to serve. Notice, first of all, in verses 22 through about verse 26, that John faithfully served in spite of supposed failure. He faithfully served in spite of supposed failure. And when you look at what's taking place in verses 22 through 26, you see that all the media, all the attention that was coming his way was negative. You're a failure. Now let's walk through this to see exactly what's going on. In verse 22, it says that Jesus and his disciples are baptizing in the land of Judea. Gentlemen, do you have that map by chance on the keynote that you could pull up so we can see exactly what's going on here? Do you have a map in the keynote at all? Okay, no worries, no worries. So I'm going to create a visual map here, okay? Here is Palestine. Here's Israel. And up top is Galilee. Down low is more central Israel and Jerusalem. The Jordan River runs north and south through Israel. So you kind of got a mental picture here. Okay, we have it up here. Great, thank you very much for pulling that up. Now, you see that little pin drop right there in the middle. That's Aenon. That's where John the Baptist was baptizing. It's up close to Galilee. You see the Sea of Galilee up north, that little blue spot. That's the Sea of Galilee up north. Now, Jesus and his disciples were baptizing further south, like almost right where that map ends. That's about where Jerusalem is. And there in the wilderness of Judea, up close to the Jordan River, where much water is there. Now, my point is this. Jesus was baptizing down south. It was more populated. There were more crowds. People were coming to him. That's what we see in verse 22. John the Baptist was staying faithful up in the country, the backwoods, where the rednecks live, up north. You know, they were the uneducated. They were the people that weren't polished. They were rough cut. And there he is where that little pin is, just staying faithful to baptize with a much smaller crowd than probably just a couple minutes before Jesus showed up on the scene. Because this is what had happened. According to John chapter 1, John the Baptist had come on the scene saying, "Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world." And he points in the back of the crowd with everybody looking at him. And he points at this lone figure who people just had known as a carpenter. But here he comes on the scene as a rabbi. His name is Jesus. And at that moment, people started following Jesus rather than John. To make matters worse, some of John's own disciples left him to follow Jesus. You say, where's that in the Bible? Read the latter part of John chapter 1, and you find disciples such as Andrew and Philip were actually disciples of John before they were disciples of Jesus, and they left John to follow Jesus. So he's losing all of his following. And he has a small crowd up north that he's trying to baptize. He has a smaller congregation there in the wilderness as he kicks up the sand and is this bright and shining light that Jesus describes later in John chapter 5. There's been a major church split. Numbers are dwindling. The attendance is declining. And you see the fate ahead of him in verse 24 when it says, "And John was not yet cast into prison." It's interesting that the Apostle John should put this in here because he's saying this is not going anywhere good, humanly speaking. You say, what would happen to John? Well, in the chapters that followed, you see this in Matthew's account as well as Mark's account. John the Baptist heard that Herod had taken his brother Philip's wife. The backstory is that he had manipulated Herodias to come and leave Philip and be his wife. I mean, he basically was the cause of an adulterous relationship. John the Baptist wasn't having it. And he went up to Herod. This is a man with a big bushy beard, honey in his beard, grasshopper legs probably still remaining around his mouth, leather skin garb, fiery eyes, leather skin tanned by the sun. And he comes up to an elegantly dressed king named Herod and said, "It's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Well, Herod feared John, but Herodias didn't. And Herodias ordered the imprisonment of John and later ordered the execution of John through an awkward place that Herod got himself stuck into. This is what verse 24 is referring to. He was going to be cast into prison and beheaded. Now, you think that's not a good trajectory to go in ministry. You're right. But John's not done talking about the failure here from a human standpoint of the Apostle John, of John the Baptist. Look at what it says in verse 25. "Then there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying." Now, what are they debating about? There's a discussion about purifying. What in the world do they have in mind? Well, the purifying touched on some of the temple ritual that Jews were expected to go through. For example, if you were to go to the southern steps of the temple today in Jerusalem, you can see these mikvahs, these pools, these cleansing pools that worshipers would go through to worship in the temple. And so that would cleanse them, that would purify them. And the Jews are saying, hey, isn't that good enough as far as to be purified just to cleanse before temple worship? Why are you baptizing people, John? And so there's a discussion going on between the critics and John's disciples. And of course, they're standing up for their leader, their rabbi John, and saying, hey, this is a new way. We're preparing the way for the Messiah. And it's almost like they pick up on that and said, oh, they're preparing the way for the Messiah. Oh, yeah, that guy that has all of your followers. Don't you realize that everybody is leaving you to follow him? They're just adding insult to injury. I can just imagine the awkwardness. The heat is rising emotionally, and John's disciples are ready to get their fists curled up and ready to take on these Jewish critics and stand up for their rabbi. It's not a pretty scene at this point. Now, before I get into how John dispelled this, beginning in verse 25, I want to just highlight this point. Faithful serving is often deemed as human failure. You get that? Now, this isn't in the keynote. This isn't necessarily in my notes. But don't forget this, that faithful serving is often equated with human failure, even in the eyes of the servant. Back about halfway through the 1900s, a little-known evangelist named Johnny Hicks lay on his deathbed at the Baylor Hospital in Texas. Nobody knew him except for a few close friends, fellow preachers. And one preacher in particular was there with him on his deathbed and tried to encourage him, saying, "Babe, you've stayed faithful to the end. You stayed faithful to the end." Brother Johnny? But he insisted that he had wasted his life and done little for Jesus. In all of his years, his decades of traveling around the southern states, trying to just preach in various churches. He said, no, you made a difference, you made a difference. He would refuse to accept that and says, no, I failed my Lord. I have nothing to show for all those years I put into ministry. And he died feeling like he was a failure. But what he did not know or wasn't aware of at that point is that preacher friend would take a trip to First Baptist Church in Dallas a few years later and be talking to the pastor of the largest church in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, W.A. Criswell. And as this preacher is talking about being at Johnny Hicks' deathbed, W.A. Criswell sat there stunned and said these words, "Johnny Hicks? In 1919, when I was 10 years old, he was the evangelist that came through and preached the gospel, and I walked the aisle and got saved under the preaching of Johnny Hicks." My point is this, that the man who died thinking he was a failure was the human agent in seeing one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century get saved. Let me put it this way. You never know what God is using through your faithfulness. Don't go by the human gauge as far as your success. Neon lights don't determine success. Being recognized on a platform doesn't equal success. People talking about your great name and your great strengths doesn't equal success. Faithfulness is success in God's eyes. And we see that with John the Baptist. Now, what makes it difficult in faithfulness is those experiences that John the Baptist went through that really question, is this worth it? I mean, for example, you're faithful to go out and go Sunday every single month, and you might even go out on Saturday morning with the School of Ministry men, and you're faithful to this, but you look out after a few months, maybe a few years, and say, nobody's ever come because of my efforts knocking on doors and meeting people. I kind of fail at this. I stink at this. Or it could be you are trying to serve, you're trying to stay engaged, and you're working with those teenagers or those elementary age kids, and you're pouring your heart into that lesson, and then it's not so much the kids you're worried about, it's those parents that always have those hopeful ideas that tend to be negative. You give that feedback. And there's drama maybe not so much with the kids, but with the parents. And it's discouraging, like I'm trying so hard to teach and to preach, and all I get is negative feedback, criticism. Could be that you have these certain ideals in your mind of what serving is going to be like. Maybe it's an ideal of just smoothness and it's going to fall into place. This is the plan. And yet as you serve, none of your plans and ideals pan out. It's far from what you anticipated. And you feel like a failure. Like everything I set out to do didn't happen. Well, John the Baptist was in your shoes. And he can empathize with that, especially when we look at what he says next. So we see that John faithfully served in spite of supposed failure, but how would he deal with this? How would he respond? How would he stay faithful in spite of people right on him saying, "You're failing"? John focused not on human success, but rather on the right motivation. So John explained his motivation. In verse 27, beginning in verse 27, he highlighted three aspects of his attitude and his focus. First of all, he acknowledged sovereignty. He acknowledged God's sovereignty. Now hear me out when I read this text and explain this. In verse 27, John answered, "Well, but that guy over there, his success is attributed to compromise. Or that guy over there, he's just manipulating." No, he's not saying anything like that about Jesus. He just says, a man can receive nothing except to be given him from God or from heaven. What he was acknowledging is God is sovereign to give people different opportunities and different gifts and different talents and different backgrounds. And therefore, God has given me this calling, this role, this gift, this personality, this physique. I'm going to just view this from him and I'm going to run with it. You see, Job acknowledged this in Job chapter 1, verse 21, when everything was stripped away from him. He said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Paul, writing to the Corinthians who were bickering back and forth about, "Well, I'm one up from you because Cephas baptized me. No, but I'm up from you because Apollos baptized me." They're going to each other. He tries to keep the peace a little bit by making this statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, in which he wrote, "For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now, if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory as if thou hast not received it?" Do you realize you are the source of nothing that you have? It didn't begin with you. You received it. "Well, I got it from my parents and the good work ethic that they instilled in me." Who gave you the parents? They came from God. "No, that came from my grandparents." Who gave you the grandparents? Hey, you eventually go back to Adam, okay? Who made Adam? I mean, it all goes back to God. God is the source of everything that we have. And here he is in a very sour situation with nothing looking very promising. And he says, hey, God's sovereign. I'm going to steward it. Now let's talk specifically about how God is sovereign in your life. God has given some of you the gift of serving, which doesn't get any limelight. And you just serve backstage. People have to really strain to see what you're doing and to recognize you. And then you have somebody else that has the gift of teaching that gets a lot of platform time. It seems like it's unequal here. Like the guy up on the platform teaching gets all the press. But the guy who is back working security or patrolling the parking lot during the services to make sure no vehicles are broken into, or the sister in the nursery, that doesn't seem like as good as up here on the platform. Hold on. This is sovereignty. Both are essential. You gotta, and God in His sovereignty has gifted some people to serve backstage, and God has gifted others to serve on the platform. And gifts are something we ought to be careful that envy doesn't slip in. Hey, there's been times, honestly, I look at somebody else's personality, I'm like, man, their personality is bigger than life. I wish I had a personality like that. Hold on, I've ignored sovereignty if I think that. Because God has given me a personality. God's given you a personality for a reason. You ought to make the most of the personality, the gifts, the income. There are some things out of our control. God has hardwired you to be smart and working with your hands. That's the way He's wired you. Well, there's someone else who's very intelligent with their brain. Well, you know the economic factor. people that work with their brains get paid more than people that work with their hands. That's reality. And so somebody working with their hands can get all up in a fit saying, well, boy, I wish I had something like that. God seems to be unfair. No, this is sovereignty. God knows what he's doing. He wires us all differently, and that could affect our income to a certain degree. But nonetheless, it's the sovereignty of God, and we can trust him that I'm going to just steward what God has given me, the smart hands or the smart mind or whatever he has gifted me. Sometimes his family background, boy, how did they get so lucky? They were raised in a good Christian home, and I come from a dysfunctional home. I was abused in my upbringing. Boy, I wish I had a background like that. Hold on, this is sovereignty. By the way, if that's where you are, the grace of God can be accented and highlighted a lot more in your life than somebody that was raised in a church home. Just something to keep in mind. God starts with some very bleak and dark beginnings to really highlight his grace. And that can really shine brightly to others. But this all comes back to sovereignty. God has put me in this place, therefore I want to make the most of it. That's where John the Baptist is. So he acknowledged sovereignty in verse 27, but notice, secondly, John highlighted his joy. John highlighted his joy. Now look at what he says in verse 28. Ye yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. Now that's actually back in chapter 1, verse 39, as well as in chapter 1, verse 23, in which John said, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah, which is Isaiah. In other words, this is my calling, to just prepare the way. I'm just a forerunner. I'm not the guy who's going to get all the limelight and win the prize. But then in verse 29, he gives a metaphor. And he says, he that hath the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy, therefore, is fulfilled. Now, we need to understand the culture of this day because this is backwards from our culture. Like in our weddings in our day, the bride is the center of attention. Not back in that day. The bridegroom was the center of attention. Interesting, huh? Well, how did that work? With the bridegroom being the center of attention. Well, the way it would work out is that there was the bridegroom who was maybe in that betrothal period with his soon-to-be bride, and he would have a friend or friends set the stage for him by making sure that the meal was set up at the bridegroom's house, and then he would make sure the bride was taking care of at her house. And the way it would work is that when everything was set by the friends, the attendants, the groom would leave his house and go with a huge caravan to meet the bride at her house and take her away with the caravan, and in doing so would shout that he is here. That's the bridegroom's voice. And take his bride and carry her back to his house, where he would have this massive feast awaiting to celebrate their marriage. And so what John the Baptist is saying is, hey, I was that attendant that was just setting things up. I made sure the meal was set up for the bride and the groom, the wedding feast. I made sure the bride was okay. I ran correspondence and clearance to make sure everything was clear there. And then I went with that bridegroom all the way there. I'll tell you what, the greatest moment of the whole ceremony is when I heard the bridegroom's voice saying, I'm here to take you away. John says, that right there was the pinnacle of joy. And that had just happened. That the bridegroom had come on the scene and he had preached saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The bridegroom had shown up on planet Earth, and he was here to seek out his followers and take them home. So what's the point of all this? John highlighted his joy of seeing people respond to the bridegroom's voice, not his voice. What lights you up? What gets you excited? What makes you happy? You have to ask my kids, it's like extra dessert, or something like that. And maybe for you, I get to go fishing or hunting. And so, I'm talking about deep. Deep joy and satisfaction, what lights you up? What brings you a lot of satisfaction? Let's be honest. Is it hearing others rave about how great you are? No, I'm all for recognizing people, but that shouldn't be our motivator. That's what we live for. First of all, we're going to be disillusioned. And if we're not disillusioned, we're probably going to be arrogant. That's not a healthy motivation as far as a source of joy. Or is it, what lights you up? Would any of you say, you know what, not getting any limelight, as long as Jesus gets the limelight? Well, amen. That's spiritual. But I think God tests us sometimes. You know how he tests us? He tests us by having another brother or sister that might be working at the same level or serving at the same level in our workplace or at the church. Not working more than you, but maybe at the same level or less than you. They get recognized and you don't. That's tough. My point is this, that when that happens, that starts to reveal what lights us up and what doesn't. And we all have an ego, myself included. There could be a wrestling match there sometimes. But John is basically saying, what lights me up is his voice. And people responding to that voice. The equivalent is, what lights me up is people responding to the gospel, getting saved and moving forward in their faith. That lights me up. I love that. So John highlighted his joy, but notice, thirdly, he stated his top desire. He stated his top desire. Look what it says in verse 30. He must increase. I like that, don't you? He must increase. I mean, after all, in Matthew chapter 3, verse 11, he had stated, I indeed baptize you with water unto repentance, but he that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose shoes I am not worthy to bear. Hey, he's going to go further than I am. This is going to be great. J.B. Phillips, in giving his paraphrase of this verse, said, he must increase more and more, and I must become less and less. Now, as you look at what he's saying here in this verse, the first part is, okay, we're cool with that. Yeah, Jesus must increase. Absolutely. I want Jesus to look big around here. But the only way Jesus increases is the same phenomenon when you hop on a teeter-totter. What happens? It goes like this. Jesus is going to increase. Dunk. You go down. But can't we have similar glory? No, the teeter-totter would have to break. Dunk. Yeah, that doesn't happen. Or dunk. No, that doesn't happen on a teeter-totter unless it becomes disattached. No, teeter-totter is he increases, I decrease. I increase, he decreases. I don't like that second half of the verse, do you? That's no fun. The fact that I have to decrease for him to increase. For Jesus to get the adequate glory, it's going to mean sometimes serving with no results. Sometimes Jesus is most glorified during those seasons. Sometimes there's a season where you get no recognition or limelight or appreciation, and yet Jesus is being glorified. Or sometimes the way you mapped it out, the plans you had, Jesus is getting the glory, even though your plans aren't working out. So recently, I was just doing some reflecting, and a very stagnant season for our church was 2018. And I was discouraged. I was down in the dumpster in the middle of a building project. I was just overwhelmed trying to oversee the building project. Nothing was happening in the church. Our attendance was way down. I mean, we had like record low attendance in the month of June of that year. And I'm like, what's going on? Do I have bad BO or what? I mean, what's the problem here? And I'm just discouraged. And this goes on for 3, 4, 5 months. And I'm like, is anything even happening here? Well, I was reflecting a little bit. I went back to my journals during that month. I'm like, okay, so what was going on during that month? And And I'm writing entries, late at night as far as, nothing is happening still, and nothing, it doesn't seem like God's working. And then at a certain point, I wrote this general entry. It's just a bullet point. Just a bullet point. It says, and Michael and Jackie Harry got baptized today. And I just moved on. I'm like, I just read that bullet point. Michael and Jackie Harry got baptized. So like in the middle of this drought, that's when Michael and Jackie are just starting to put their roots down deep. They aren't getting any press. It's not even really on my radar. They're being discipled by someone else. I mean, they're just somebody that's just kind of coming. But when I look at where Michael and Jackie are now, I'm like, that's where it started in the drought. What I deemed as failure. In other words, Jesus was being glorified during the stagnant season. You tracking me this evening? And that's how God works. And by the way, that reminds me that God gets the glory for what he's done in Michael and Jackie's life. Definitely not this pastor. Because that was a failing summer, if you will. In the same way in your life, when you seem like it's a failure, nothing's happened, you're bombarded with trials, and man, you're just trying to hang on for survival and stay faithful and keep on keeping on, that's when Jesus could be working the most. That's when Jesus could be glorified and lifted up in ways you can never imagine. So John explained his motivation. Now here's the point. The joy of serving is found in our motives for serving. The joy of serving is found in our motives for serving. In other words, if our motives for serving are off, our joy will be minimal. But if our motives are correct, they're vertical, consumed with Jesus getting the glory, with him being big, we'll have the greatest satisfaction. Know that he is the one that is being honored and glorified. Now, let me just say what I am not saying for a moment. I am not saying that we're going to just limit recognition at Hillview Baptist Church. We're never going to recognize anybody's success or what they've done in our church because we don't want them to get too hooked on, men's approval. We're not going to go that way. I think it's very healthy to recognize, like we did at the Eilers. That was a lot of fun on Sunday night, to maybe mention in passing what somebody is doing, to say, hey, appreciate so-and-so what they're doing in the service or serving in the nursery, recognizing maybe a ministry that we do from time to time, such as we did recently with our nursery workers. That's healthy to do. I'm not saying we're not going to recognize people. What I'm saying is that should not be my personal survival or your personal survival to be recognized. We want Jesus to be recognized. So turn over to John chapter 5. John chapter 5. Now, this is after John is imprisoned. Verse 35. This is referring to John. He said, he, John, was a burning and a shining light, and ye were willing for a season to rejoice in his light. He was just temporary. He was just there for a time. But what Jesus is saying is, he accomplished his mission. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. Now turn over to Matthew chapter 11, verse 11. I'm going to go full circle to where I began this message a few moments ago. Matthew chapter 11. Now look at verse 11 as we bring this to a close. Matthew chapter 11, verse 11. Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Now let me stop for a second. Jesus is saying in his book, John the Baptist is greater than Moses, than David, than Isaiah and Ezekiel, with all the press and attention they got. There's a lot more in the Bible about those guys than about John the Baptist. But he is saying there's none greater. Now, he looks future and gives hope for us. And he says, notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven, which he is preaching, he's looking future tense, is greater than he. So let me put it this way. Up to Jesus' time, John the Baptist was the greatest ever. With no limelight, no media, no attention his way. But he's saying, hey, you in 2022, you stay faithful serving through the trials, the tribulation you're going through, you remain steadfast, you're up there with John. You're right up there with John the Baptist status. So my encouragement to you tonight, brothers and sisters, is just to stay faithful with the right motives. Just keep on keeping on. I'm not saying overhaul anything. This isn't a come forward, let's repent of our sin. It's more of, let's just keep on keeping on as a church. And I think the greatest days are yet ahead for you personally in your journey, for us as a church corporately. I realize there's some realities I've talked about already, but I believe that God has some great things planned in the future as we just stay faithful moving forward for the glory of God. Let's go and stand with heads bowed and eyes closed as we conclude our service together.